The steam engine hissed, a tired dragon breathing its last white breath into the Wyoming twilight. It was a sound of finality. The iron wheels of the last train of the season ground against the track, the shriek of metal a protest against the cold that was already seizing the landscape. A bitter wind, born somewhere near the spine of the continent, swept across the plains. It carried ice, not snow, fine particles that stung the skin and blurred the world into a smear of gray and white. The storm had swallowed the horizon whole. Here, at the edge of nothing, sat the station. It was little more than a wooden box, its yellow paint peeling back to reveal raw, silvered timber. Kerosene lamps, bolted to the eaves, flickered inside their caged glass, casting weak, dancing circles of light that the wind tore at. The conductor shoved the door open, letting a gust of frigid air and ice crystals whirl down the aisle of the passenger car. "Garnet Station, end of the line. This train goes no further till the thaw." Clara Hensley pulled her thin wool coat tighter. The fabric was worn. The nap rubbed smooth over the elbows and waist. It was a city coat, useless against this kind of cold. She gathered her small, battered valise, her knuckles white on the handle. She stepped down from the car, her boots sinking into 6 inches of fresh drift on the platform. The cold was immediate, a physical blow that stole her breath. It burned her lungs, sharp as glass. She looked around, her heart a cold stone in her chest. No one. The platform was empty. No man in a heavy coat, no wagon waiting with steam pluming from the horse's nostrils. Just the wind, the dying hiss of the engine, and the vast, terrible emptiness of the plains. Her fiancé, Mr. Randall Creighton, was not here. She stood trembling, a small, dark figure against the immense white. The train crew, shadowy figures in the gloom, uncoupled the engine to move it to the roundhouse, or what passed for one in this desolate place. Their shouts were thin, ripped away by the gale. In minutes, the passenger car she had just left was dark, its small, life-giving stove already cooling. The wind found the flaws in the station's construction. It howled through the broken boards over the ticket window, a high, mournful sound like a mourning dove's call amplified into a scream. A single telegraph wire, stretched taut from a pole beside the station, hummed a low, ghostly note. It was the only sound that seemed alive, and it sang of isolation. Clara clutched her coat at the throat. The cold bit through the wool, through her dress, through her skin. She felt the fear, colder than the ice, begin to creep up from her stomach. She was alone, truly, utterly alone. She had read his letters. Mr. Creighton's hand was firm, his words practical. He owned 1,000 head of cattle. He had written. He had a solid house. He needed a wife to manage it, to bring order. He had enclosed the money for her ticket. She had pictured a man who was sturdy, perhaps quiet, but reliable. A man who would be waiting for her. He was not reliable. He was not here. She pushed open the station's waiting room door. The hinges groaned. Inside, it was scarcely warmer than the platform. The air was dead, smelling of soot, old tobacco, and dust. A pot-bellied stove stood in the center, its iron surface thick with rust, its belly cold. A few wooden benches, scarred with carved initials and boot marks, lined the walls. In a small, glass-walled office, the station master's chair was empty. A ledger lay open on the desk, its pages ruffled by the draft that snaked under the door. He was gone, fled the storm, likely back to the cluster of buildings that passed for the town. A sign nailed to the wall read, "Garnet, population 42. 3 miles away," the conductor had said. 3 miles of this. She looked back out the grime-caked window. The world was gone, erased by the swirling snow. 3 miles was an eternity. It was a death sentence. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had frozen with the landscape. Clara sat on the edge of the hardest bench, her valise at her feet. She could no longer feel her toes. Her breath, when she let it out, plumed in front of her face, a small cloud of her own vanishing warmth. She had tried rubbing her hands together, but the friction created no heat. Her skin was waxy and pale. She pressed her face against the cold glass of the window, searching the impenetrable darkness for the light of a lantern, for the shape of a horse. Nothing. The railroad tracks were already disappearing, the steel rails buried under a smooth, deadly blanket. She thought of the locket, her father's locket, the last thing she had of him. Gold, heavy, with a tiny, intricate engraving of a willow tree. She had sold it in Chicago to buy a thicker pair of boots and this coat. The coat was a failure. She had betrayed his memory for nothing, to come to this place and freeze to death on a bench. A new sound cut through the wind, a heavy, rhythmic crunch. Clara sprang to her feet, her heart leaping with a sudden, painful hope. She wiped a clear circle on the frosted pane. A shape emerged from the dark. It was not a wagon. It was a man, mounted on a tall horse that favored its left foreleg. The animal was dark with sweat despite the cold. Its head hung low, rimed with ice. The man was large, broad in the shoulder, a creature of the storm itself. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, its collar turned up high, and a hat pulled low, its brim caked with snow. Frost clung to his beard, making his face a white mask in the gloom. He did not ride to the station door. He stopped 20 yards away, near the water trough, a solid block of ice. He dismounted, his movement stiff, agonizing. He ran a gloved hand down the horse's leg, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Then he turned, his head lifting, and saw her. He saw the pale oval of her face pressed against the glass. Elias Boone cursed the cold, the horse, and the godforsaken cattle drive that had left him stranded. His gelding, Buck, had stepped in a prairie dog hole 2 miles back, and the limp was bad. He had pushed the animal too hard, trying to beat the storm into town. He had failed. He was a ranch hand between jobs, a drifter by necessity. He had been a soldier, but that was a lifetime ago, a life that had cost him his 2 brothers and his belief in just about anything. He had seen men die for worse reasons than a blizzard, but he had not planned on it being his turn tonight. He needed shelter, a place to rub the horse down and wait for the cold to kill him or let him go. The station was the only thing standing for 10 miles. And now he saw it was occupied. A woman, staring at him like a spooked deer. His first instinct was to mount up and ride on. A woman in a place like this, at this time, meant trouble. It meant complications. It meant a softness he could not afford. He was haunted by distrust, a lesson bought with blood and betrayal. He wanted no part of her. He looked at his horse. Buck trembled, his coat a frozen, muddy plaster. The animal would not make it another mile. He cursed again, under his breath. He tied the reins to the hitching post, knowing the horse would not move anyway, and pulled his saddlebags free. He limped toward the station door, his body aching from a week in the saddle and a fight with a longhorn that had left his ribs bruised purple. When he pushed the door open, the wind shoved him inside. Clara scrambled back, clutching her valise to her chest like a shield. He was huge. The low light of the room, lit only by the gray twilight from the windows, made him seem larger. He filled the doorway. Snow cascaded from his hat as he took it off, slapping it against his thigh. His face was hard, cut from granite and chapped raw by the wind. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were guarded, tired, and held no kindness at all. "Ma'am," he grunted. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, sharp and reluctant. He dropped his saddlebags by the door. He did not look at her again. He walked the perimeter of the small room, his spurs ringing softly on the floorboards. He kicked the stove. Cold iron. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the wind pour through the gaps. He turned back to her. She was shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. Her face was pale, her lips a faint, alarming blue. She looked breakable. She looked like she was already dying. He looked away, toward the broken ticket window. He had a blanket roll on his saddle. He had half a bottle of whiskey in his bag. He had his own survival to think about. But the sound of her shivering was relentless. It was the sound of a small animal caught in a trap. With a sigh that was pure frustration, he unstrapped the thick wool blanket from his saddlebags and tossed it toward her. It landed on the bench beside her. "Cover up," he said. His voice was a low rasp. "You'll be dead before midnight." Clara stared at the blanket. It was heavy, dark wool, and it smelled of horse, smoke, and sweat. It was also, she knew, the warmest thing in this room. She fumbled with it, pulling it around her shoulders. The rough wool scratched her chin, but it held a faint, residual warmth from his body. It was an anchor. He watched her for a moment, his face grim. Then he turned and went back outside. Clara's heart pounded. Was he leaving? The thought terrified her. As much as this rough stranger scared her, the idea of being alone again was worse. He returned seconds later, his arms full of splintered wood. He had ripped 2 boards from the side of the cattle pen. He dumped them near the stove, went back out, and returned with 2 more. He did this 4 times, his movements economical and strong, until a respectable pile of wood lay on the floor. From his bag, he pulled a tinderbox and a heavy knife. He knelt, shaving dry curls from the edge of a board. He struck a flint and steel, nursing the spark in the tinder until a small flame caught. He fed it splinters, then larger pieces, arranging them inside the rusted belly of the stove. The dry wood caught fast. A plume of acrid smoke puffed from the stove's joints before the draft caught and drew it up the chimney pipe. A low, crackling roar began. Heat. It was a miracle. A dull, radiant warmth began to push back against the killing cold. Elias Boone hunkered down on his boot heels, feeding the fire, his back to her. He seemed to have forgotten she existed. The silence stretched, filled only by the fire and the scream of the wind. Necessity had forced them together, but a wall of distrust stood between them. Clara finally found her voice. It came out as a croak. "Thank you," he grunted, poking the fire with a stick. I was waiting," she said, needing to explain herself, to prove she was not some fallen woman. "For Mr. Creighton, from the Three Forks Ranch. He was supposed to meet me." Elias turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. "Creighton, yeah, I know him." The way he said it made her stomach tighten. There was no respect in his tone, only a flat, cold knowing. "He is not here," she whispered, stating the obvious. "No, he ain't," Elias said, turning back to the fire. "Man like Creighton does not ride in a storm like this for anyone but himself." He fed another piece of wood into the flames. The firelight flickered on the hard planes of his face. "The town," she said, her voice shaking. "Is it far?" 3 miles. Might as well be 300 tonight." He stood up, peeling off his frozen gloves. He flexed his hands, his knuckles red and swollen. "You were not planning on walking it, were you?" I do not know." He gave a short, harsh laugh. "You would not have made it 20 yards. You would have fallen, and the snow would have covered you by now." His realism was brutal, and she shrank back. He saw her fear, and his expression softened. Just a fraction. The hardness in his eyes was replaced by a deep, bone-deep weariness. He sat on the bench opposite her, keeping the stove between them. "Name's Elias Boone," he said, not offering a hand. "Just trying to get my horse to shelter. Did not mean to spook you." Clara Hensley." They sat in silence again. The heat was making Clara's body ache as it thawed. "You from back east," he stated. It was not a question. Her coat, her speech, her sheer unsuitability for this place announced it. "Pennsylvania," she said. "That's a long way to come for a man you do not know." His words hit her like a slap. Her cheeks flushed, a painful, hot feeling against her frozen skin. "You have no right to say that. It is a free country. Ma'am, I can say what I see. And I see a mail-order bride who got left at the station." Shame washed over her, hot and sickening. He had summed up her entire, desperate gamble in one crude sentence. "My father died," she said, her voice low and fierce, needing this stranger to understand. "There was nothing left. The farm was sold for his debts. I had no trade. Mr. Creighton offered a home." Elias watched her. The firelight caught the tracks of tears freezing on her cheeks. He looked away, uncomfortable. He was a man used to violence, to hardship, but not to this, not to the quiet, desperate sorrow of a woman. "To afford the ticket," she continued, the words spilling out of her, driven by the cold and the fear. "I had to sell my father's locket. It was all I had left of him." She did not know why she told him this. Perhaps it was a confession, offered up to the storm. Elias said nothing for a long time. He pulled a tin of coffee and a small, blackened pot from his saddlebag. He went to the door, scooped a handful of clean snow from the drift, and packed it into the pot, which he set on the stove. "War took my brothers," he said, his voice flat, staring into the flames. "Took them near Shiloh. Bandits took my pa's ranch down in Texas. Took everything. Left him and my ma shot dead in the yard." He rubbed his scarred hands together. "There is always something that gets sold. Miss Hensley. Or something that gets taken. It all comes to the same." He was not offering sympathy. He was just stating a fact of the world as he knew it. He was a ranch hand. He told her, between jobs. He had been a soldier, but he did not want to talk about that. He just wanted to get to town, get his horse cared for, and drink a bottle of whiskey. The coffee began to melt, then steam. The aroma filled the small room, cutting through the smell of dust and smoke. It was the most comforting smell Clara had ever known. He poured the muddy brew into a single tin cup and pushed it across the floor toward her. "Drink. It is hot." She picked it up. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost spilled it. The tin was scoured, but she wrapped her fingers around it, desperate for the warmth. As the night deepened, the storm's voice rose to a full-throated roar. The small station shuddered under the assault. Snow piled against the windows, blotting out the last of the light, encasing them in a tomb of white and darkness, lit only by the red glow of the stove. Clara drank the coffee. It was bitter, thick with grounds, but it was life. It sent a thread of fire down into her belly, but it could not reach her hands or feet. They were numb, dead weights. She set the cup down, fumbling. She looked at her hands in the firelight. They were a pale, waxy white, the nails tinged with blue. She tried to make a fist, but the muscles would not obey. A new, sharper fear pierced through her exhaustion. Elias saw it. He saw the way she was staring at her own hands, with a kind of disconnected horror. He moved before he had time to think about it. He knelt in front of her, his knees cracking. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the ice still clinging to his beard. "Give me your hands," he commanded. She stared at him, uncomprehending. "Your hands. Girl, now." She lifted them, pale and useless. He pulled off his thick outer gloves. His hands were bare. They were rough, scarred across the knuckles, the nails blunt and dirty, but they were warm. He enclosed her right hand between both of his. The contact was a shock. His skin was calloused, almost abrasive, but the heat from him was a living thing. It was the first real warmth she had felt in days. It sank into her frozen flesh, and with it came a pain so sharp it made her gasp. It felt like needles, like fire, as the blood was forced back into the dying tissue. He did not rub. He just held, his grip firm, relentless, forcing his life into her. She whimpered, the pain and the relief mixing into one unbearable sensation. She was trembling violently now, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that shook her whole body.
I'm freezing,
she chattered, the words barely audible.
Please.
The word hung in the air between them. It was a plea for more than warmth. It was a plea against the dark, against the storm, against the crushing loneliness of her fate. Elias did not look at her face. He kept his eyes on her hand, his expression grim, concentrated. He could feel the deathly cold of her skin. He held her tighter, his thumb pressing into her palm. The moment stretched. There was nothing in the world but the roar of the wind, the crackle of the stove, and the feeling of his rough hands holding hers. It was an intimacy more profound than a kiss, a desperate, practical act of survival that was tangled with something else. He felt her smallness, the fragility of her bones. She was promised to another man, a man he despised. He was a drifter who had learned to trust no one. And yet, here they were, bound by a fire and a storm. He felt a sudden, unwelcome pull toward this stranger, a protective urge he had thought long dead, buried with his brothers. It was a feeling of guilt, that he was touching what belonged to Creighton, mixed with a fierce, unspoken tenderness. Outside, a coyote cried, its call thin and sharp against the wall of the wind. Elias let go of her right hand and took the left. The snow was piling up against the door, burying the tracks, sealing them in. They were trapped, together, at least until morning. Dawn did not break. It seeped. A weak, gray stain spread across the eastern edge of the world, offering illumination, but no warmth. The light crept through the grime of the station windows, revealing the full extent of their prison. Clara woke first. She was stiff, her neck aching. She was still on the bench, but she was wrapped in Elias's heavy wool blanket and the new, stiff coat he had pulled from the trunk. For a moment, she was disoriented, the smell of dust and axle grease confusing her. Then she remembered. Elias was not on his bench. He was on his feet by the stove, feeding it more of the splintered boards. He moved with a quiet economy, his body tight against the cold. He had not slept well. She had felt him stir half a dozen times, adding wood, listening to the wind. She sat up, the blankets pooling in her lap. The small room was thick with the smell of smoke and their shared breath. "He's not here," she said. Her voice was a dry croak. Elias did not turn. "Who?" "Mr. Creighton. I thought perhaps the storm let up. Perhaps he came." "No one's come," Elias said, jamming a piece of wood into the stove. The fire flared, casting sharp, dancing shadows. "And the storm hasn't let up. It's just resting." He was right. The wind had quieted its scream to a high, steady whine, but the air outside was still thick with blowing snow. He walked to the door, pulled it open a crack. The wind snatched it, forcing him to fight the wood. A blast of ice crystals and frigid air invaded the room, making Clara gasp. He shoved the door closed, the latch clicking with grim finality. He looked at her. His face, in the thin morning light, was etched with fatigue. The frost was gone from his beard, but the skin beneath was raw. "The horse is bad, Miss Hensley. That leg is swollen thick, and the drifts are over my waist by the platform." "So we wait?" she asked, the hope draining from her. "We do not," he said. He grabbed his saddlebags. "He cannot carry me, but he might carry you. I'll lead him. We'll try for town." He did not ask. He commanded. This was survival, and he was taking charge. He checked the old revolver tucked in his belt, a habit more than a necessity, and pulled his hat low. "Stay here. Do not let the fire go out. I'll bring him to the door." He left. The room felt immense and terrifyingly empty without him. She listened to his fading footsteps, the crunch and drag as he fought the snow. She hurried to the window, rubbing the frost, and watched him. He was a dark shape, moving with painful slowness toward the leaning shed where he had tied the horse. He was right about the snow. It was not a landscape. It was a white, rolling ocean. The drifts were sculpted by the wind into waves, treacherous and deep. He sank to his thigh, lunged forward, and sank again. It took him 10 minutes to cover the 30 yards. He disappeared into the shed. She waited, her heart hammering. She heard the horse nicker, a sound of pain, thin and desperate. He reappeared, leading the animal, Buck. The tall gelding was coated in a plaster of ice and snow. The horse was trembling, favoring the left foreleg so badly it barely touched the ground. Each step was an agony. Elias tried to lead him toward the platform. The horse took 2 steps, plunged its good leg into a deep drift, and snorted in panic, rearing back. Elias held the reins, speaking to it in a low, calm voice that the wind tore away. He tried again, turning the horse toward what used to be the tracks. The animal lunged, foundered, and went down onto its front knees, its head dropping low. Elias stood for a long moment, his hand on the horse's neck. He looked at the animal, then he looked at the station, then he looked toward the invisible town. Clara saw his shoulders slump. It was the posture of absolute defeat. He fought the horse back to its feet, his movements full of a gentle anger. He led the limping animal back to the shed. When he returned to the waiting room, he was covered in new snow. He did not brush it off immediately. He just stood by the door, breathing hard, the defeat still clinging to him like the ice. "We're not going," he said. It was a flat statement. "Not today. We try to move in that. We're both dead. The horse, too." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They were trapped. The flimsy hope of her fiancé, of the town, of any rescue, was gone. It was just this room, this man, and the storm. "Another night," he said, more to himself than to her. He crossed to the stove and kicked the door shut. The sound was violent. "We need more fuel and food." He turned his attention to the station master's office. The door was locked. He didn't hesitate. He used the heel of his boot, striking the wood near the knob. The flimsy lock splintered, and the door swung open. Clara flinched. He was breaking in, but the law seemed very far away. The office was small, crammed with manifests and telegraph equipment. It was as cold as the grave. Against the back wall sat a large black trunk. The words Union Pacific were stenciled on its side in white, fading letters. Elias dragged it into the main room, closer to the stove. The lock was heavy brass. He worked at it with his knife, prying and twisting, until the hasp snapped. He lifted the heavy lid. The trunk was a collection of forgotten things: a thick ledger, a broken telegraph key, a set of heavy chains, and, tucked in the bottom, supplies. "Well," he grunted, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Looks like the station master did not plan on starving." He pulled out 3 swollen, unlabeled cans, a dusty oil lantern, and a small sack of coffee beans. Underneath it all was a heavy, dark blue wool coat, the kind railroad brakemen wore, lined with thick flannel. It smelled of coal smoke and axle grease. He tossed the coat to her. "Put that on. It's better than yours." She did as she was told, pulling the heavy garment over her own thin one. It was huge, swallowing her, the sleeves hanging past her fingers. But it was warm, and the weight of it felt like armor. Elias worked on the cans. He had no opener, so he used his heavy belt knife, punching holes in the lid and sawing it open. The contents were beans, pale and suspended in a thick, gelatinous liquid. He found a small, rusted pan in the office, cleaned it with snow, and dumped the contents of all 3 cans in. He set it on the stovetop to heat. While he worked, Clara felt a sudden, desperate need to do something civilized, to connect with the world she had lost. She dug in her valise and pulled out her small, leather-bound writing kit. She had paper, a steel-nibbed pen, and a small, glass bottle of ink. She sat on the bench, balanced the paper on her lap, and tried to write. "Dear Mr. Creighton." She dipped the pen in the ink, The ink was thick, a dark slush. When she touched the nib to the paper, it left no mark. She tried again, scraping the nib against the glass. A tiny, frozen bead of black ice formed on the tip. She stared at it. The cold was so profound, so absolute, that it had frozen the very words she meant to write. It had stopped her thoughts, her plea for help, her connection to the man she had crossed a continent to marry. The futility of her journey, of her entire life, crystallized in that single drop of frozen ink. Her hand trembled. She looked at the stove, at the hungry, orange flames visible through the grate. She took the piece of paper, the one with no words, and held it to the opening. The corner blackened, curled, and flared into a bright, clean flame. She watched it burn until it was nothing but a fragile black ash that disintegrated on the updraft. She had burned her letter. She had burned her last hope of rescue. Elias stopped stirring the beans. He had watched the whole thing. He did not speak, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a flicker of something she had not seen before. It was not pity. It was understanding. He portioned the beans onto 2 tin plates he'd found in his saddlebag. They were mushy, tasting of salt and metal, but they were hot. They sat on opposite benches, eating in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin. When they finished, the gray light outside was already beginning to fade. The day had been stolen from them. The firelight began to take over the room, painting the walls in shades of red and orange. The shared meal, the flickering light, the isolation. It created a strange, false intimacy. The silence, which had been a shield, now felt heavy. "You never saw a fight, did you?" he said. It was not a question. Clara looked up, startled. "I saw my father argue with a banker. It was not pleasant." Elias almost smiled. It was a brief, bitter twist of his lips. "Not what I mean." He poked the fire with a piece of broken chair rung. "I was with the 12th Regulars. For the Union, we thought, I do not know what we thought, that we were saving something." He stared into the flames, his face hardening as he looked past the stove, into a place she could not see. "We marched through Virginia. We were told they were traitors, that they deserved what they got." He paused, his voice dropping. "But they were just boys, farmers, like me, like my brothers." He fed another piece of wood to the fire. The flames leaped. "I was at Antietam, by the sunken road. It was not glory, Miss Hensley. It was just noise, and work, like chopping wood. Only the wood screamed." He stopped, swallowing. "I have killed men who were running away. I have killed men who were trying to surrender. I killed a boy, could not have been more than 15, who was trying to get a drink from a creek. He had dropped his rifle. He was just thirsty." Elias rubbed his face, the rasp of his beard loud in the quiet room. "I shot him, and when I went through his pockets for papers, all he had was a letter from his sister, talking about her new calf." He fell silent. The confession hung in the air, thick as smoke. "I never forgave myself," he whispered. "Not for him, not for any of them. You kill something that does not deserve killing. It takes a piece of you with it. You do it enough. You are not much of anything left." Clara watched him, her fear of this large, rough man dissolving. He was not a brute. He was a shell, haunted by the things he had done to survive. She found herself answering his confession with her own. "I was supposed to marry Mr. Creighton to survive," she said softly, her voice gaining strength. "Not to love. I told myself that. I told myself it was a practical arrangement, a bargain." She looked down at her hands, clasped tight in her lap. "My father was a good man. He taught Latin and read poetry, but he knew nothing of money, nothing of the world. When he died, the bankers took the house. They took the books. They took everything." "I had no skills," she continued. "No trade. I was to be a governess or a companion or a wife. Those are the choices. I chose this. I chose to sell myself to a man I had never met, just for a roof and for food. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You killed for survival. I was just trying to do the same. They sat in the deepening quiet, two strangers bound by the confessions of their ruined lives. The fire began to sink again. The stove, which had been a source of life, was now losing its battle with the cold. The chill crept back into the room, reclaiming the corners, pushing toward them. Clara shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor. She tried to pull her feet up onto the bench, to tuck them under the heavy coat. "What is it?" Elias asked. "My feet," she whispered. I cannot feel them. Not since last night." His eyes snapped to her boots. They were the same thin-soled city boots she had arrived in. They were still damp. "Take them off," he said, his voice suddenly sharp.
I cannot. The laces are frozen."
He was in front of her in an instant, kneeling on the rough floorboards. "Hold still." He did not ask permission. He took his knife and, with a quick, deft movement, slit the frozen leather laces. He worked her right boot off, his movements rough, impatient. The stocking beneath was damp and stiff. He peeled it down. Clara looked, and for the first time, she truly felt the ice in her veins. Her toes were not red, they were not blue. They were a stark, waxy, yellowish white. The smallest two were a mottled, deathly gray. Elias swore, a low, vicious sound. He had seen this. He had seen it at Sharpsburg, in the winter camps. He knew exactly what it was. "It's frostbite," he said, his voice flat. "Will I?" She could not finish the question. "You will if we do not fix it. Now." He grabbed her foot. It was like holding a piece of cold marble. He hesitated, his face torn. This was not her hand. This was an intimacy that crossed a line that still existed. Even here, he was a stranger, and she was another man's intended. But the sight of that dead, white flesh, the thought of the rot that would follow, pushed him past the thought. It was an ache of compassion, sharp and unwelcome, but undeniable. He had to. He cupped her heel in one hand and began to rub her foot with the other. Hard. He chafed the skin, his calloused palm scraping against her, trying to force friction, to force life. "It is going to hurt," he warned her, his voice a low growl. "It must." He rubbed, relentless, his grip like iron. He breathed on her toes, his own hot breath a shock against her frozen skin. And then the pain came. It was not a dull ache. It was 1,000 hot needles, a fire spreading from her ankle down into her toes. It was excruciating. She cried out, a high, thin sound, trying to pull her foot away from him. "No," he commanded, holding her fast. "Hold still. Clara, it is working. Do not fight it." He called her Clara, not ma'am, not Miss Hensley. The pain was overwhelming. It was more than she could bear. The fear, the cold, the exhaustion, the shame of her failed journey, the humiliation of having this strange man hold her barefoot in his hands. It all crashed over her. She broke. She began to weep, silently at first, the tears freezing on her cheeks. Then a sob escaped her, a ragged, broken sound that echoed in the small, dark room. She wept for her father, for her locket, for the life she had lost, and for the agony in her foot. Elias stopped rubbing. He looked up, his face inches from hers. Her features were crumpled in a mask of pure, exhausted misery. He did not know what to do. He was a man of action, of horses and cattle and guns. He knew nothing of this, of a woman's tears. He finished his work, rubbing until a faint, painful pink returned to the white skin. He pulled the dry blanket from his own bedroll and wrapped her foot in it. Tight. He did the same for the other, slitting the laces and fighting the ice, the pain, and her sobs. When he was done, He did not return to his bench. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his work finished. She was still crying, her body shaking with quiet, exhausted sobs. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. He rose, went to the bench, and sat beside her. He was stiff, awkward. He did not touch her. She leaned away, hiding her face, ashamed of her breakdown. "It is all right," he mumbled, staring at the stove. But she could not stop. The trembling was too deep. Emasculated by her tears, he did the only thing he could. He reached out, his arm heavy and uncertain, and put it around her shoulders. He pulled her against his side. Clara resisted for a moment. Then she simply collapsed. She leaned her head against his chest, burying her face in the rough, smoky wool of his coat. She clutched his coat, her hands making fists. He held her. He said nothing. His hand, large and scarred, rested on her back, patting her in a clumsy, rhythmic way. He stared over her head at the fire, his jaw tight, listening to the wind rattle the roof and the quiet, desperate sound of her weeping. The storm howled, but inside the small station, there was a fragile, human silence. Gradually, the sobs subsided. Her breathing slowed, deepening into the rhythm of exhaustion. The wind rattled the tin chimney pipe. The fire crackled. Elias did not move. He sat rigid, holding this strange, broken woman against him. He felt her smallness, the sharp bones of her shoulders. He felt the dampness of her tears soaking through his shirt. It was a strange, unwelcome tenderness, a feeling that made his chest ache. Hours passed. He fed the fire, reaching across her, his arms still around her. She was asleep. Her breathing was deep, her body a dead weight against his. Elias let his own eyes close. The night was long, and the cold was relentless. He leaned his head back against the wall, his cheek pressing against the top of her hair. It smelled faintly of soap and the cold. They slept, leaning against each other. Two ruined souls clinging to a small island of borrowed warmth in a world that had none. It was not a sleep of peace, but of truce, a fragile dream in the heart of the blizzard. Outside, the wind sculpted the drifts, and in the gray, pre-dawn light, unseen, a line of fresh horse tracks appeared in the snow near the station. They were deep, made by heavy-set men. The tracks paused, circled the silent building, and then moved on, disappearing into the swirling white toward the distant, sleeping town. Someone was searching. The sound was a violation, a hard, wooden rapping that shattered the fragile quiet of the station. It was not the wind. The wind whined and screamed. This was a fist. Clara jolted awake, her heart leaping into her throat. She was still pressed against Elias, his arm a heavy, warm weight across her back. The stove was low, its red eye barely visible through the grate. The room was bitter cold. Elias was awake before his eyes opened. His entire body went rigid. He had heard it too. He moved, sliding his arm off her, a silent, fluid motion. He was on his feet, his hand already on the butt of his revolver, his weight balanced. "Who's there?" His voice was a low growl, meant only for her. The knock came again, harder this time. A man shouted, his voice muffled by the door and the wind. "Open up! We know she's in there. Open this door, or I'll kick it in." Clara scrambled back, pulling the heavy railroad coat around her. She fumbled for her slit boots, her mind fogged with sleep and terror. "Stay behind the stove," Elias ordered. He moved to the center of the room, facing the door. He did not draw his weapon. Not yet. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. It was not kicked in. It was shoved by three men who spilled into the room in a cloud of snow and frigid air. They were large, dressed in heavy buffalo coats and furs. Their faces were hidden by thick beards and hats pulled low, all caked with ice. They carried rifles. The weak light of the dying fire glittered on the frozen metal of the barrels. Behind them, a fourth man stepped in. He was different. He was tall, and his coat was not the rough hide of a hunter, but a tailored black wool, its collar trimmed with beaver fur. He took off his hat, slapping the snow from it. His hair was dark, neatly combed, his face clean-shaven save for a precise mustache. He was handsome, in a cold, sharp way. His eyes, the color of dark ice, scanned the room. They passed over Elias with a flicker of contempt. They landed on Clara. His face did not soften with relief. It tightened with a possessive, cruel anger. "Clara," he said. His voice was sharp, educated, and held no warmth at all. "Get your things. You have kept me waiting." This was Randall Creighton. Clara could not move. This was the man who owned 1,000 head of cattle, the man who had promised her a home. He looked at her not as a person, but as a parcel that had been misplaced.
"Mr. Creighton,"
she stammered, rising slowly.
"The train, the storm, I thought—"
"You thought what?" he snapped. He took a step toward her, his eyes raking over her, taking in the massive brakeman's coat, the bare feet she was trying to hide, the man standing between them. His gaze lingered on Elias, on the rumpled blankets by the stove where they had slept. His lip curled. "I ride for 12 hours in a blizzard, tracking my own property, only to find it used."
"That is not what this is,"
Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room.
"The lady was freezing. I made a fire."
Randall turned his full attention on Elias. He looked him up and down, from his worn boots to his scarred face. It was the look of a man assessing livestock. "And who are you?" Randall sneered. "Some drifter sharing his blanket?" "Name's Elias Boone. I was sharing a fire, which is more than you were doing."
"Mr. Creighton, please,"
Clara pleaded, stepping forward.
"He saved my life, my hands, my feet. I was freezing to death when he found me."
Randall ignored her. He kept his eyes on Elias. "You saved her? A man like you does not save a woman. Boone, he takes an opportunity. She was meant to be mine, clean. You have spoiled her." The accusation hung in the air, vile and heavy. It was a sentence, delivered in front of these rough men, who were watching Elias with a cold, amused interest. "She is a lady," Elias said, his voice dropping lower, the calm before a storm. "You will speak to her as one—" "She is what I paid for," Randall shot back. "She is my property, and you, drifter, are trespassing." He took another step. Elias did not move, but he seemed to grow larger, a solid block of defiance. He was blocking Randall's path to Clara. "Step aside." "No."
"Mr. Creighton!"
Clara cried out, her voice desperate. "Stop this! It is a misunderstanding. I am grateful you came. I will get my things. We can go." She was trying to reason with him, to placate him, but her plea only fueled his rage. He saw it as proof of her guilt, of her familiarity with the other man. "You will go when I say—" Randall spat at her. Then he looked at Elias. "I gave you a chance. Vagrant." Randall's hand moved. It was not the quick draw of a gunfighter, but the sudden, vicious movement of a bully. He did not pull the trigger. He ripped the heavy Colt revolver from his holster and, in the same motion, swung it like a club. Elias tried to turn, to block it, but he was too slow. The steel barrel caught him high on the temple. The sound was a sickening, wet crack. Elias staggered, a grunt of pure pain forced from his lungs. His knees buckled. He did not fall, but he braced himself against the wall. His hand flying to his head, blood, dark and immediate, streamed between his fingers. "Elias!" Clara screamed. She lunged forward, but one of the men in buffalo coats grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a trap. "Stay put, girlie." Randall stood over Elias, his chest heaving, the revolver still in his hand. "That is for touching what is not yours." Elias leaned against the wall, his vision blurring. The room tilted. He could feel the warm blood running down his cheek, into his beard. He looked at Clara, at the terror in her eyes, at the brute hand holding her arm. "Now," Randall said, straightening his coat. His composure regained. He pointed the gun at Clara. "Get your valise. My men will take your trunk. We are leaving. You will be married by dawn, as we agreed."
"You are a monster,"
Clara whispered, her body trembling with a new kind of cold, pure, unadulterated hatred. Randall laughed. "I am a man who gets what he pays for. You would do well to remember that. Jed, Silas, get her trunk. You." He pointed at the man holding her. "Put her on my horse if she resists." The man holding her grinned, his teeth yellow in the dim light. Clara snatched her arm away.
"I will not be touched by you."
She grabbed her small valise. The other two men hoisted her trunk, grunting at the weight, and carried it out into the gray, swirling snow. Clara looked back at Elias. He was sliding down the wall, his strength failing. His eyes were still open, fixed on her, filled with a helpless, burning fury. "Come, Clara," Randall ordered, grabbing her by the elbow. He dragged her out of the station, out of the small, smoky pocket of warmth, and into the raging heart of the storm. Elias was alone. The room was freezing. The door was wide open, the wind already sweeping a fine layer of snow across the floor, covering the dark spots of his blood. He pushed himself up, his head exploding with pain. The world swam in a red-gray fog. He touched his temple. The cut was deep, to the bone. He heard them outside, horses stamping and snorting, men shouting orders. Randall's sharp voice, cutting through the wind, and Clara's. She had cried out, a short, sharp sound, quickly muffled. He staggered to the door. Grabbing the frame for support, he watched them ride away. They were four dark shapes, hunched against the wind. Randall had Clara seated in front of him on his saddle, holding her like a prisoner. They disappeared into the white curtain of the storm. "No?" Elias whispered. The word was a puff of steam in the cold. "No, not like this." He had seen that look in Randall's eyes. It was not just anger. It was a cold, cruel ownership. A man who called a woman property and spoiled was capable of anything. He would not just marry her. He would break her. He turned, stumbling back to the stove. His vision cleared slightly. He grabbed the tin cup, scooped snow into it, and pressed it to his bleeding head. The agonizing cold shocked him, but it helped. It cut through the fog. He found his hat, pulled it low. He grabbed his saddlebags. He checked his revolver. All 6 rounds were there. He shoved the gun back into his belt. He went to the door and stepped out into the blizzard. The wind hit him like a physical blow. The cold was a living thing, sinking its teeth into his wounded head, his exposed skin. He was bloodied, his ribs ached, and his head felt like it was splitting in two. But the image of Clara's terrified face, of her being dragged away, burned hotter than the pain. He would not let her disappear into that cruelty. He would not let another good thing be destroyed while he stood by. He pushed through the deep drift, his boots sinking to the knee. Their tracks were already fading, the wind scouring them away, but they were fresh enough. He could follow. He slogged toward the lean-to, his horse. Buck whinnied softly, a miserable sound. The animal was shivering, its bad leg held completely off the ground.
"I know, boy,"
Elias muttered, his voice thick.
"I know it is not fair."
He could not ride him. He could not even lead him. The horse would die. He looked at the tracks, then at the animal. He made the choice. He pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard, checked its action, and stuffed a box of cartridges into his coat pocket. He left the horse. He left the saddle. He took only his rifle, his remaining strength, and the burning rage in his chest. He turned his face into the storm and began to walk. The world was white. There was no sky, no ground. just the swirling, blinding snow and the howl of the wind. Visibility was less than 20 yards. The snow was deepening, the drifts treacherous. He fell twice, plunging to his chest, the impact jarring his head, sending fresh waves of nausea through him. He kept going. He lost the tracks within a mile. The wind had wiped them clean. He was following nothing, blind. He stopped, chest heaving. The blood from his head wound freezing in his beard. He was alone, in a white hell, chasing ghosts. He nearly turned back. What could one man, on foot, wounded, do against 4 armed men on horseback? Then he smelled it. He lifted his head, turning, tasting the wind. Faint, but it was there. Wood smoke. They had made a camp. They were not trying to ride all the way to town in this. They were close. They were arrogant. They thought him beaten. He turned, walking directly into the wind, following the scent. It was a desperate gamble. The smoke was thin, torn apart by the storm, but it was a thread. He followed it. Clara knelt by the fire, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold the spoon. They had stopped in a small hollow, sheltered by a dense stand of pines that broke the worst of the wind. The men had set up a quick, brutal camp. A fire blazed, fed by whole branches ripped from the trees. Randall had thrown her from the horse, her body landing hard in a deep drift. She had no boots. Her wrapped feet were already numb, the cold biting deep. "You will earn your keep," Randall had sneered, shoving a heavy cast-iron skillet and a sack of salt pork at her. "Cook. The men are hungry." She was now a camp servant. She cooked, her mind numb with shock. The man named Silas watched her, the one who had grabbed her in the station. He sat polishing his rifle, a thin smile on his face. Randall sat opposite the fire, drinking from a silver flask. He had not stopped looking at her. "You are quiet," he said, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "I prefer them quiet, but you were not so quiet back there. Were you, with that drifter?" Clara kept her eyes on the frying pork. "I wonder what else he saved you from," Randall taunted. "Did he keep you warm, Clara? Did he tell you stories? Did he get a taste of what he was not supposed to touch?" "Stop it," she whispered. "Stop what? Stating facts? You spent the night with him. You slept beside him. Do not lie to me. I saw the blankets. You are used, a ruined woman. But do not worry." He took a long drink from the flask. "I will still marry you. I paid for you, and I will get my money's worth. I will teach you respect. I will teach you what it means to be a wife." His words were poison, sinking into her. She looked at the sizzling meat. A heavy kitchen knife, used for cutting the pork, lay on the crate beside her. It was thick, sharp. Her hand moved, slowly, her fingers shaking. She looked at Randall. He was watching Silas, laughing at some crude joke. She slid the knife from the crate, with a smooth, desperate motion. She hid it in the folds of her dress, tucking the handle into her waistband. Beneath the heavy railroad coat, it was cold steel against her skin. It was a small, sharp piece of hope. The storm was at its peak. It was near midnight. The wind shrieked through the pines. The men were huddled close to the fire, their horses tied to a rope line. Miserable, their backs to the wind. Elias moved like a ghost. He had circled the camp, coming in from the downwind side, the trees masking his approach. His head was a solid block of throbbing pain, but his mind was clear, cold as the steel of his rifle. He saw the horses first, 4 of them, plus Randall's, 5 total. He saw the fire. He saw the men, their guards down, trusting the storm to protect them. And he saw Clara, kneeling, her head bowed, her body shaking. He did not wait. He moved to the picket line, his knife, still stained with dried beans, slid silently. He cut the rope. He slapped the nearest horse on the rump, a hard, stinging blow. The animal screamed. It bolted, crashing through the camp. The other horses, suddenly free, followed it, panicked by the storm and the sudden noise.
"Horses! Get the horses!"
Silas roared, jumping to his feet. Chaos. Men scrambled, grabbing for reins that were not there.
"Boone!"
Randall bellowed, seeing the dark figure emerge from the trees. A gun flashed. The bullet snapped past Elias's ear, close enough to feel the heat. Elias did not fire at Randall. He fired at the man closest to Clara, the one who had grabbed her. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The man spun, clutching his leg, and went down.
"Clara, run!"
Elias yelled, his voice raw. Clara did not hesitate. She was on her feet, the knife falling from her dress, forgotten. She ran, not toward Elias, but away from the fire, into the darkness of the trees. Randall saw her go. He raised his revolver, aiming not at Elias, but at her retreating back.
"No!"
Elias roared. He charged, bringing his rifle up like a club. He was too far to shoot, but not too far to stop the shot. He slammed the rifle butt into Randall's arm just as the gun fired. The bullet went wild, zinging into the high branches. Randall cried out in pain and fury. Gunfire erupted. The other two men were shooting, their bullets thudding into the trees around Elias. Elias grabbed Clara's arm as she stumbled past.
"This way! Go! Go!"
He shoved her in front of him, turning to fire one last shot into the darkness near the camp. He did not aim to hit. He aimed to scare. They ran. They plunged into the unbroken snow, away from the hollow, into the full, screaming force of the wind. Clara had no boots. Her stockinged feet, briefly warmed by the fire, were now plunging into waist-deep drifts. The cold was immediate, paralyzing. She fell. "I cannot! My feet!" Elias hauled her up. He did not speak. He half dragged, half carried her, his wounded head spinning. He put his body between her and the camp, expecting a bullet in the back at any second. They heard shouts behind them, but the wind and snow swallowed the sound. They were running blind, fueled by pure, desperate terror. They ran for miles, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time ceased to exist. There was only the cold, the pain, and the snow. Clara's legs gave out. She collapsed, her body limp. Elias stumbled, falling with her. They landed in a heap at the base of a huge, skeletal cottonwood tree, its bare branches clawing at the gray sky. Clara was not moving. Her lips were blue, her skin a waxy gray. Ice crystals were forming in her eyelashes.
"Clara!"
Elias shook her. She moaned, a low, animal sound. A new pain, sharp and hot, flared in Elias's left shoulder. He looked down. A dark stain was spreading across the wool of his coat. He had been hit in the chaos. He had not even felt it. He ignored it. He ripped his own coat off, his body instantly assaulted by the wind. He wrapped it around Clara, pulling her tight against him, sharing his body heat. He tucked her head under his chin. She was shivering, a violent, dying tremor. "You are safe now," he whispered, his voice cracking, his own teeth chattering. He pressed his face against her icy hair. "You are safe, but do not close your eyes. Do you hear me, Clara? Do not close your eyes." Elias did not know how long he held her. Time was measured in the slowing of her shivers, in the gradual return of his own breath, the pain in his shoulder, which had been a distant hot spark, now flared into a throbbing, sickening fire. The blood was freezing to his shirt, making the fabric stiff. He could not stay here. The cottonwood offered no shelter, and the wind was a blade, cutting through his thin, blood-soaked shirt. He would die, and she would die in his arms. "Clara," he shook her, gently this time. "Clara, we have to move. We have to find shelter." She moaned, her head rolling against his chest. She was not conscious, but she was not dead. She was somewhere in the frozen, gray twilight in between. "Just a little farther," he whispered, though he did not know if it was true. He gathered his strength. He pushed himself to his feet, a low grunt of agony escaping his lips as his shoulders screamed in protest. He bent, hooking his good arm under her knees, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of wet wool and fragile bones. He began to walk. He had no direction, no plan. He just moved away from the sound of the shouts, which were long since swallowed by the storm. He followed the vague depression in the landscape that suggested a creek bed, hoping it might lead to a cabin, a cave, anything. Each step was a negotiation with the snow. He plunged into drifts that stole his breath, his wounded body crying out. The arm holding Clara felt like it was tearing from its socket. His head wound, the one Randall had given him, throbbed in time with his heart. He was bleeding from 2 places, freezing from 1,000 more. He did not know if he walked for an hour or a minute. The world was a white, howling void. Then he saw it, a darker shape against the gray, a perfect, unnatural square. It was a box, a small, wooden cabin, no bigger than a shed, set back from the frozen creek, half buried in a drift. A rusted tin pipe poked crookedly from its roof. A telegraph cabin, one of the old ones, abandoned when the line was moved north. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through him. He kicked the door. It was frozen shut. He kicked it again, using his last reserve of strength. The rotted wood of the jamb splintered, and the door fell inward with a crash, revealing a square of perfect, suffocating darkness. He stumbled inside, falling to his knees on the dirt floor, still clutching Clara. He did not let her go. He crawled, dragging her with him, to the far corner, away from the open doorway. The cabin was a tomb. It was dark, airless, and only marginally warmer than the storm outside. But it was still. The wind could not reach them here. Its scream was muffled to a distant, mournful howl. He laid Clara down. Her eyes were closed, her face a pale, waxy mask. "Fire," he muttered, his own words slurring. "Need fire." His body was failing. The cold was inside him now, in his bones. He fumbled in his coat pocket, his fingers numb. Useless claws. The tinderbox. He had it. He crawled around the small space. He found a broken chair in the corner, its wood dry as dust. He found a stack of old, brittle papers, old manifests. Perhaps he found a small, rusted hatchet. He worked with a desperate, clumsy focus. He hacked at the chair, his bad arm sending jolts of fire up his neck. He piled the splinters in the center of the room. On the cold dirt, he struck the flint and steel. Once, twice. His hands were shaking too badly. A spark caught the tinder. He bent low, his vision tunneling, and blew on it. His breath, weak and ragged, almost put it out. Then a tiny, hesitant flame licked the edge of the paper. He fed it splinters, then larger pieces of the chair. The fire caught. It was a small, greedy thing, casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls. It was pathetic. It gave off almost no heat, but it was light. It was alive. Elias slumped against the wall, his strength gone. The fire was not enough. The cold was winning. He looked at Clara. She had not moved. He dragged himself back to the doorway. The snow was already drifting inside. He grabbed the broken door, hauled it upright, and shoved it back into the frame, wedging it shut with a hatchet. It was a flimsy barrier, but it stopped the wind. The cabin was now sealed. The smoke from the small fire had nowhere to go. It began to fill the tiny space, stinging his eyes, choking his lungs. "No," he coughed. He crawled to the tin chimney in the roof. A plate of rusted metal covered it. He pushed at it with the rifle barrel, again and again, until the plate gave way with a screech and clattered onto the roof. The smoke began to draw, sluggishly, up the pipe. The fire burned better, brighter, but it was still not enough. It was a hungry fire, and the chair was almost gone. He looked around. The cabin was bare, save for a wooden table, nailed to the wall. He took the hatchet. He began to chop. He hacked at the thick planks of the table, his breath coming in sobs, the sound of the impacts echoing in the tiny space. He chopped until his arm gave out, and he had a small pile of wood. He fed the fire. It grew, a real fire now, a circle of warmth in the suffocating cold. He crawled back to Clara. She was still, too still. He felt for a pulse at her throat. His own fingers were too numb. He lowered his head, pressing his ear to her chest, through the layers of his coat and her dress. He waited. A beat, faint, slow, another.
She was alive.
He sat back, relief washing over him, leaving him hollow. He looked at his shoulder. The front of his shirt was a stiff, black-red board. He had to stop the bleeding. He tried to pull the shirt away. It was frozen to the wound. He gritted his teeth and ripped it free. A fresh, hot gush of blood ran down his chest. The bullet had gone clean through, high on the muscle. It was messy, painful, but it had not hit bone. He looked around. He had nothing. Clara's eyes fluttered open. She stared at the roof, at the dancing shadows. She did not know where she was. She saw the fire, and then she saw him. He was kneeling, stripped to the waist in the frigid air, his skin pale and slick with blood. The firelight played on the old, white scars that mapped his chest and back, and the new, vivid red one on his shoulder. He was trembling, not from cold, but from shock and pain.
"Elias?"
she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. He looked at her. His eyes were unfocused, dark with pain. She pushed herself up onto one elbow. The movement sent the world spinning, but she ignored it. She saw the blood. She saw him dying. "The cloth," she said. "What?"
"In my valise, my petticoat. It is clean."
He just stared at her. She pushed herself to her knees. It was an agony. Her feet were blocks of wood, numb and distant. She crawled to her valise, which Elias must have carried, though she did not know how. She fumbled with the latch. She pulled out the fine, white cotton petticoat, one of the last good things she owned. Without hesitation, she ripped it into long strips. She crawled to him.
"Let me."
He did not resist. He slumped, his strength gone. Her hands were shaking. She was terrified of the blood, of the wound, of his closeness. But the sight of his sacrifice, the raw fact of his wound, cut through her fear. He had done this. For her. He had come back. He had bled for her. She dipped a strip of the cloth in the snow she had scooped up to clean his head wound. She gently, clumsily, washed the blood from his skin. He hissed, his body rigid, but he did not pull away. "Hold this," she ordered, her voice trembling but firm. She pressed a thick pad of cloth against the entry wound. "Press hard." He obeyed, his good hand covering hers. His skin was hot, feverish, against her own icy fingers. She went behind him. The exit wound was larger, torn. She cleaned it as best she could in the smoky light. She took a long strip of cloth and began to wrap his shoulder, binding the pad tight. She had to loop it under his arm, across his chest, pulling it taut. She was close to him, her face inches from his back. She could smell the smoke, the sweat, the sharp, metallic tang of his blood. She could feel the heat rolling off his skin. She finished the binding, her hands trembling so hard she could barely tie the knot. She sat back on her heels. He let his hand fall away. He was pale, but the bleeding had slowed. They stared at each other in the flickering, inadequate light. They were trapped, wounded, half frozen.
"You should not have come for me,"
she whispered, the tears welling in her eyes, hot against her frozen cheeks. Elias looked at her. He looked at her bare, ruined feet, which she had tucked beneath her. He looked at the terror that still lingered in her eyes. "Did not know how not to," he answered. His voice was thick. The simple, honest words broke something inside her. He had not come for her because she was his. He had not come for honor. He had come because he could not, in his heart, leave her to that fate. He had come because he was a good man, despite all the killing, despite all the hardness. They talked, softly, their voices barely carrying above the crackle of the fire and the renewed howl of the wind outside. The night was a black, endless ocean, and their fire was a single, tiny candle. They confessed things that daylight would have kept hidden.
Sometimes,
she said, staring into the flames.
I felt so alone back home. I thought I would just stop, just fade away, like a ghost. I thought marrying Mr. Creighton would make me real. It would give me a name, a place.
She laughed, a short, bitter sound.
Someplace.
I know lonely, he said, his voice a low rumble. He leaned his head back against the rough cabin wall, his eyes closed.
After the war, I had no one. My brother's gone, my folks murdered. Every man I rode with was either running from something or running toward a bullet. You ride with men like that long enough, you forget how to talk. You forget how to be human. Loneliness ain't just being by yourself. It is like death. It is knowing not a single soul in this world would care if you just stopped.
The world judges us, she said, pulling the heavy coat tighter.
They look at me, and they see a woman who sold herself, a harlot, ruined.
And they look at me, he said, opening his eyes, the firelight reflecting in them. And they see a drifter, a killer, a vagrant, worthless, just another body to fill a grave. We are the same. Clara, we are the things the world throws away.
The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of their shared understanding. He was not a brute. She was not a ruined woman. They were just lost. His restraint, the wall he had built around himself for 10 years, began to crumble. It was the pain, the blood loss, the cold. But mostly, it was her. It was the sight of her, trembling, tending his wound, her small hands gentle on his skin. It was her confession, which mirrored his own. The tension between them, which had been born of fear and necessity, now shifted. It became something fierce, something tender. He was so very tired of being alone. She saw the change in his eyes. The hardness was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability, a deep, aching need. It frightened her, and it drew her in. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his, not the one on his good arm, but the scarred, rough hand that lay on his knee. His skin was calloused, but warm. He did not pull away. He turned his hand over, his fingers brushing hers. She looked at their hands, then up at his face. The firelight carved shadows under his cheekbones, made his eyes deep and dark. He was looking at her, not with hunger, but with a kind of desperate awe, as if he were seeing a person for the first in years.
"Elias?" she whispered. She leaned in, driven by an impulse she did not understand, a need for comfort that was more powerful than her fear. She rested her head on his chest, his good side. She could hear it, under the thick wool of his undershirt. She could hear his heartbeat. It was strong, steady. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of life. It was the most real thing in the world. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she left Pennsylvania, she felt not safe, but anchored. Elias went rigid. Her hair was soft against his chin. He could feel her breath, warm against his skin. His good arm, the one not bound to his chest, came up. He hesitated, his hand hovering over her back. Then he touched her, his fingers spreading wide, holding her as if she were made of glass. He held her. She did not weep. She just rested. He lowered his head, pressing his cheek against the top of her hair. He smelled the smoke, and something else, something clean and sweet that was just her. He had not held a person in kindness in 10 years. The feeling was a pain all its own, a thawing of a part of him he had thought long dead. She tilted her head back, looking up at him. Her face was pale, smudged with soot and tears.
Her lips were parted, blue from the cold but soft. He looked down at her mouth, and she looked at his. It was not a decision. It was an inevitability. Like the storm. Like the cold. He lowered his head. She rose up to meet him. Their lips met. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, clumsy, and raw. It was a collision. It tasted of salt from her tears, smoke from the fire, and the metallic tang of his blood. It was a kiss of shared desperation, a frantic affirmation of life in the face of death. It was two ruined souls clinging to each other in the dark. He deepened the kiss, his good arm pulling her tight, his mouth hard on hers. She did not resist. She kissed him back, her small, cold hands coming up to clutch his shirt, holding on as if she were drowning. Then, as suddenly as it began, it broke. Clara pulled back, her eyes wide, her hand flying to her mouth. She was breathing hard, as if she had been running. Elias stared at her, his own breath ragged. The firelight showed the flush on his cheeks, a mix of fever and something else. Guilt crashed over them, immediate, cold. She was another man's intended. He had struck her fiancé. He had stolen her, and now he had... He had broken the last unspoken rule. He had taken advantage of her, of the situation. He was no better than Randall. "Clara, he started, his voice a raw whisper. She scrambled back, away from him, pulling the coat tight around her. "A shield. No, please, we should not have..." She was frightened, not of him, but of the kiss, of what it meant, of what it made her. Randall's words echoed in her head. Ruined, spoiled. "I am sorry," Elias said, and he meant it. He looked away from her, back at the fire, shame burning in his gut, hotter than his wound. It was not right." The silence in the cabin was thick, suffocating. It was filled with their unspoken desire and their new, shared fear. The intimacy was shattered, replaced by a terrible, awkward chasm. Outside, as if in answer to their turmoil, a new sound joined the wind, a long, high, hunting cry. A wolf. Another answered, closer this time. Clara stifled a cry, pressing her back against the cabin wall. The wolves were circling, drawn by the smell of the blood, or just hunting in the storm. The fire was their only protection. Elias grabbed the last pieces of the table and threw them on the flames. The fire leaped, a defiant, roaring beast. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, not speaking, not looking at each other. They listened to the wind, and to the wolves, and to the frantic, guilty beating of their own hearts. Morning came, gray and grudging, just as it had the day before. The fire was a pile of dying, white embers. The cabin was freezing. The wolves were gone. Elias was stiff, his shoulder a solid block of agony. He had not slept. Neither had she. He rose, his joints cracking. He had to face the day. He had to get wood, find food. He had to get her to town. He went to the door and pulled it open. The world was gray. The snow was falling again, but gently this time. Soft, silent flakes, like ash falling from a dead sky. The air was heavy, still. He looked out, and his blood ran cold. They were not alone. 4 riders were approaching, dark shapes moving slowly through the falling snow. They were a quarter-mile away, following the frozen creek. Elias stepped back, grabbing his rifle. Clara was on her feet, her face pale. "What is it?" "Riders," he said, his voice flat. He knew who it was. He could feel it. She came to the door, peering over his shoulder. She saw them, and she saw the man in the lead, the one in the fine, dark coat. Randall. But he was not alone. The 3 men with him were not his ranch hands. They wore stars on their chests. Lawmen. "He survived," she whispered, her voice hollow. "He brought the law."
Randall had his arm in a sling, but he sat tall in the saddle. He pointed toward the cabin. Elias looked at the back wall. There was no other door. No escape. "Clara," he said, his voice urgent. "Listen to me. When they get here, you tell them I took you. You tell them I forced you. You scream. You tell them. Whatever you have to, he will believe you. He wants to. You can still be safe." He was offering her an escape. He was offering her his life. They would hang him for abduction, for shooting at Randall. He knew it. Clara looked at him, at his pale, exhausted face, at his blood-soaked bandage, at the rifle in his hand. She remembered his hands, warming hers. She remembered his arm around her as she wept. She remembered the desperate, honest taste of his kiss. She shook her head. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was harder than steel. "Clara, this is not a game," he hissed. "They will hang me." "And what will they do to me?" she said, her eyes flashing. "Let him take me? Let him marry me? Knowing what he is, knowing what he calls me? I am already ruined in his eyes. I am already worthless. At least I will not be a liar." She took a deep breath, her small body straightening. "I will not run. We will face them together." Elias looked at her, a strange, fierce pride swelling in his chest. He had considered it, bolting out the back, making a run for it. But she was right. Running only fed the lies. Running meant he was guilty. He nodded. Just once. He leaned his rifle by the door. He stayed. They stood together in the doorway of the small, dark cabin. Waiting. The air grew heavy. The silence broken only by the soft, falling snow and the jingle of harness. Growing closer. The four riders solidified out of the falling snow, their horses breathing great, white plumes of steam. The man in the lead was Randall Creighton, his arm in a crude sling, his handsome face contorted with a mixture of pain and righteous fury. The other three were lawmen. The one in the center was older. His face a map of wind-burned wrinkles, a heavy tin star pinned to his buffalo coat. This was Sheriff Brody. He looked at the small, smoking cabin, then at the two figures in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene with a weary, practiced neutrality. Randall did not wait for the sheriff. He urged his horse forward, stopping 10 feet from the door. "There they are! Sheriff!" Randall's voice was sharp, a command. "Just as I told you, he took her. He shot me when I tried to stop him. He dragged her out into the storm to defile her." He spat the last word like a curse, and it hung in the cold, heavy air. Elias stood silent. He had not moved, his rifle still leaning by the door. He was exhausted, the blood from his shoulder a stiff, cold plaster under his torn shirt. The pain was a dull, constant fire, and the world had a gray, unsteady edge. He looked at the sheriff, at the rope looped on the man's saddle, and felt a strange, cold calm. He was ready. He had lived a hard life, and this was a hard end. But he had saved her. He had done that one thing. He would not fight. He would not speak. He would let it happen, if it meant she could be free of this. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his movements stiff. He looked at Elias, at the bloody, makeshift bandage Clara had tied, then at Randall's sling. He looked at Clara, who was half hidden behind Elias, trembling. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice not unkind. "Are you Miss Hensley?" Clara did not answer for a moment. She felt Elias's body beside her, a wall of wounded, weary flesh. She felt the cold terror, but beneath it, the ember of rage that had been kindled in Randall's camp was now a steady flame. She stepped out from behind Elias, into the open. She was a frightful sight. Her hair was matted with snow and soot. Her face was smudged with his blood. Her feet were wrapped in bloody, frozen rags. She was still wearing the oversized railroad coat, which made her look like a small, lost child. But her voice did not shake. "I am Clara Hensley," she said, her voice clear, carrying in the still, snowy air. Randall smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "Tell him, Clara, tell him what this animal did to you." Clara kept her eyes on the sheriff. "He did not kidnap me. Sheriff, Mr. Creighton lied." The shock of her words was absolute. The two deputies shifted in their saddles. Randall's smile vanished, replaced by a dark flush of pure disbelief. "I was at the station," Clara continued, the words coming faster now, tumbling out of her. "Mr. Creighton left me there. For 2 days. This man," she pointed to Elias, "found me. I was freezing. He built a fire. He saved my hands. He saved my feet." "She's lying," Randall roared, lurching forward on his horse. "He's turned her head. He's threatened her." "He did not threaten me." Clara's voice rose, a shriek against the snow. "You did. You came to the station. You hit him. Your men. They dragged me from the station. He came for me. He saved me from you." The sheriff looked at Randall, his eyes narrowing. He had known Randall Creighton for years, knew his wealth, his influence, and his temper. He also knew the look of a terrified woman. Randall's control, the thin veneer of the civilized rancher, cracked and fell away. He had been defied, publicly, by his own property. You liar!" he screamed at her, his voice breaking with rage. "You ungrateful harlot, sleeping in a station with a drifter, running off with him. You are a ruined woman. Do you hear me? Ruined. No decent man would have you. You are nothing." The words struck Clara harder than a physical blow. She flinched, her newfound strength crumbling, the shame washing over her, hot and sickening. Elias moved. He did not think. He did not plan. He lunged. His body, fueled by a last white-hot surge of protective fury, launched from the doorway. He was not aiming for Randall's horse. He was aiming for Randall. The two deputies had their guns out before he took a second step. "Hold!" Sheriff Brody bellowed, his own revolver in his hand, aimed not at Elias, but at the sky. "Stand down! Boone! Stand down!" Elias froze, his good hand clenched into a fist, his body trembling with the effort of holding back. He was exposed, his chest heaving, his wounded shoulders screaming. He looked at Randall with a pure, murderous hatred. Randall looked back, his face pale, but his eyes triumphant. He had won. He had proven it. The man was a violent animal. "You see, Sheriff," Randall said, his voice smooth again, full of false pity. "He's mad. He attacked me in my own camp, and he tries it again, in front of you. The girl is clearly terrified of him, forced to repeat his lies. He has bewitched her." Sheriff Brody sighed. He holstered his weapon. This was a mess. A rich man's word against a drifter's, a confused woman's word against them both. There was a bullet wound. There was an abduction claim. "I cannot sort this here," Brody said, his voice flat with authority. "I am taking you both in. You, Boone, for assault, and you, Miss Hensley, for your own protection, and for questioning." He nodded to one of the deputies. "Cuff him." The deputy dismounted, pulling heavy iron cuffs from his belt. Elias did not resist. He turned, put his good hand behind his back, wincing as the cold metal locked onto his wrist. The deputy cuffed his other arm, the one with the wounded shoulder, forcing it into a position of pure agony. Elias bit down on a groan, his face ashen. "Put the woman on your horse, deputy," the sheriff ordered. "And you, Mr. Creighton, ride ahead. We will meet you in town." Randall looked like he wanted to argue, to demand she be given to him, but he saw the look in the sheriff's eye. He nodded, curtly. "As you say, Sheriff, justice must be served." He reined his horse around and rode off, his back straight, a man assured of his victory. The journey back was a new kind of hell. The falling snow could not hide the cruelty of the world. Clara was half-conscious, her body finally surrendering to the cold, the terror, and the lack of food. The deputy had slung her over the front of his saddle like a sack of feed. She was aware of the motion, the jarring, endless plodding of the horse. She was aware of the cold, which had sunk so deep she no longer shivered. Elias walked. They had not trusted him with a horse. He was tied by a lead rope to the sheriff's saddle horn, forced to trudge through the chest-deep snow. Every step was a fresh wave of pain from his shoulder. The cuffs bit into his wrists, raw. His feet, in their worn boots, were long past frozen. But he did not look down. He kept his eyes on Clara. He watched the way her head lolled, her body limp. He saw the gray, deathly color of her skin. He had failed. He had saved her from Randall, only to deliver her to a town that would judge her, and to a jail that would kill him. He had taken her last chance at a life. And for what? A kiss in a dark cabin, a moment of warmth. He was a fool, a dead fool. It took them 3 hours to cover the miles to Garnet. The town was not much. A single, wide street, choked with snow and mud, lined with false-fronted buildings. A saloon, a general store, a land office, and a small, white church. But it was alive. As they rode in, a spectacle of law and disorder. The town came to watch. Faces appeared in the steamed-up windows of the mercantile. Men in aprons stepped out. A group of rough-looking men, the same ones from Randall's camp, spilled out of the saloon, their faces grim. They watched Elias, their eyes promising a different kind of justice. But it was the women who did the most damage. Clara, her head lifting in a moment of pained consciousness, saw them. They were wrapped in shawls, clustered on the boardwalk in front of the general store. They did not shout. They did not accuse. They just whispered. Their faces were hard, closed. They looked at her, this strange woman, half dead, in a man's coat, her feet in rags, being brought in by the law. They looked at the blood on Elias, and at the smug, injured figure of Randall Creighton, who was waiting for them outside the sheriff's office. They saw a story, and they wrote it in their heads. Mail-order bride. The whisper was sharp as ice. Gone wrong, ran off with that drifter. Look at her, no better than she should be. Scandalous, absolutely scandalous. One woman, tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine, stepped forward. It was Mrs. Gideon, the preacher's wife. Her face was a mask of cold piety. "Sheriff Brody," she called out, her voice carrying, "What is the meaning of this? Bringing this filth into our town? She is a blight, a temptation to sin." "She is a witness, Mrs. Gideon," the sheriff said, his voice weary. He would rather have faced a gunfight. "She is a harlot," the woman declared, as if it were a verdict. "She has brought shame upon us. The church will not stand for it. She must be exiled. Cast her out." Clara shrank, her eyes closing. She wished the cold would just take her. She wished she had never woken up. "She will be held in my jail, ma'am. That is the law," Brody said. He dismounted and helped the deputy lift Clara down. Her legs buckled, and Elias lunged forward, despite the cuffs, a strangled noise in his throat. The deputy shoved him back. "Get him inside," the sheriff ordered. They were dragged into the jailhouse. It was a small stone building, cold as the grave. It smelled of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and despair. There was a main room with a sheriff's desk and a stove, and beyond that, a short corridor with 2 iron-barred cells. Elias was shoved into the cell on the right. The deputy unlocked his cuffs only to slam the heavy door shut, the sound of the lock clicking home a note of finality. Clara was put in the cell opposite. It was identical, a narrow cot, a single, threadbare blanket. It was a cage. "I am sorry. Miss Hensley," Sheriff Brody said, his back to Elias. "It is for your own safety, Mr. Creighton is influential, and Mrs. Gideon has the town's ear. You are safer in here until the circuit judge arrives. That may be days." He left them, closing the main door to the cell block, leaving them in the gray, freezing twilight. Night fell. The jail was silent, save for the drip of melting snow from the roof and the distant, tinny sound of a piano from the saloon. The stove in the outer office provided no warmth back here. Elias lay on his cot, his body on fire. The wound in his shoulder was throbbing, a deep, sickening pulse that he felt in his teeth. He was feverish, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the sound from the cell across the hall. Clara was weeping. It was not the desperate, exhausted sobbing from the cabin. It was a low, quiet, broken sound. The sound of a person who had lost everything, including her name. The whispers of the townswomen had done what Randall's violence and the storm could not. They had destroyed her. Elias pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. He went to the bars of his cell. "Clara," he whispered. Her weeping stopped. She was a small, dark shape on her own cot. "Clara, come here, to the bars." He heard her stir. She rose, her movement slow, and came to the front of her cell. In the dim light, he could see her face, pale and tear-streaked. "You have to listen to me," he said, his voice urgent, a harsh rasp. "There is still a way. When the sheriff comes, you have to tell him. You tell him I forced you. Tell him I hit you. Tell him I did what Randall said I did, that I used you." He could barely get the words out. They tasted like ash. "You tell them you were terrified," he pushed on. "That you only said those things at the cabin because I had my rifle. You tell them you want to go with Randall, that you want to marry him." She stared at him, her eyes wide with a new horror. "What? No, Elias, no! Ah, you must," he hissed, gripping the bars, his good hand white-knuckled. "Do you not understand? They will hang me anyway. They are going to hang me. My word means nothing. But you are a woman, a wronged woman. They will believe you. They want to believe you. That preacher's wife, she will take you in. She will save you. You can live. You can still have a life." He was offering her the only thing he had left, his own guilt. He was ready to wear the label of a monster if it meant she could walk out of this jail. Clara looked at him, at this broken, feverish man, who was willing to be called a beast just so she could be called a lady. She did not answer. Instead, she knelt. She knelt on the cold, filthy stone floor of her cell, her body just inches from his. She reached her hands through the bars. "Elias," she whispered, her voice thick, but no longer weeping. "When I was on that train, I was nobody. I was a parcel to Mr. Creighton. I was property to those women. I am filth." She looked up, her eyes finding his in the dark. "But in that station," she said, her voice dropping, "when I was freezing, and you held my hands, you did not ask who I was. You did not ask if I was worthy. You just held me. You held me when I had no name left, when I was nothing." Her hands found his. She laced her small, cold fingers through his, gripping his one good hand through the iron bars. "They can call you a killer," she whispered fiercely. "They can call me a harlot. They can say whatever they want, but they will never understand that. They will never understand what it is to be saved, not by a lawman or a preacher, but by a person." She would not do it. She would not save herself by destroying the one man who had seen her as human. Elias stared at their joined hands, a strange, hot pressure building behind his eyes. He had not cried in 20 years. He would not now. But the feeling was so strong it choked him. He squeezed her fingers, his thumb rubbing the icy skin of her knuckles. They stayed like that, kneeling on the frozen floor, their hands clasped in silence through the iron bars. It was a vow, a final, fragile moment in a world that had no place for them. The next morning, dawn came with the sound of a key in the main lock. It was not the sheriff. The jailhouse door slammed open. Randall Creighton stood there, flanked by his 2 hired men, Jed and Silas. He was clean-shaven, his arm in a smart, black silk sling. He looked rested, and he looked victorious.
"Sheriff Brody,"
he called out, his voice booming in the small office. The sheriff stumbled out of his back room, his hair mussed, his suspenders hanging.
"Creighton, what is the meaning of this?"
Randall smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression. He tossed a sheaf of papers onto the sheriff's desk. "That," Randall said, "is a writ of release, signed by Judge Abernathy himself. I rode all night to meet him at the county line. He agrees the charge of abduction is baseless, a lover's quarrel. He has released Miss Hensley into my custody. As her legal fiancée, I am responsible for her." The sheriff picked up the papers. They looked official. The signature was the judge's. He had no way of knowing it had been secured with a thick stack of bills.
"Now, Randall,"
the sheriff began.
"I do not know if that is wise."
"It is not a request, Sheriff," Randall said, his voice turning to steel. He nodded to his men, who moved past the sheriff, toward the cell block. "I have forgiven her. I am taking my future wife home." He stepped into the corridor. He looked at Elias, his eyes full of triumphant malice. Then he looked at Clara.
"Get your coat, my dear,"
he said, his voice a grotesque parody of affection.
"It is time to go."
Clara did not move. She stood in the center of her cell, a small, still figure in the heavy railroad coat. The men, Jed and Silas, stopped at the open cell door, uncertain. They looked back at Randall.
"What are you waiting for?"
Randall snapped, his voice echoing in the stone corridor.
"Take her."
Jed, the larger of the 2, took a step into the cell. He reached for her, his hand open, stained with dirt and tobacco.
"Come on, miss. He's got the paper."
Clara looked at his hand, then at his face. She saw the man from the station, the man who had held her arm in a bruising grip. She saw the man from the camp, who had watched her with that cold, amused smile.
"No,"
she said. The word was quiet, barely a whisper, but it was as solid as the iron bars. Jed's smile faltered. "Ma'am, you heard the boss. You are coming with us. Judge's orders."
"I said no."
She said it louder this time. She took a step back, her hand clutching the collar of her coat.
"I will not go with him."
From the cell across the hall, Elias pushed himself against the bars.
"Clara,"
he whispered, a warning. "This is not the way. Save yourself." She ignored him. She kept her eyes on Randall, who was now stalking down the corridor, his face darkening with impatience.
"Clara, do not be a fool,"
Randall said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He stopped just outside her cell, framed by the door. "I am offering you a home. I am offering you my name. I am forgiving your lapse. Do not make me take back that offer."
"It is not an offer,"
she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength.
"It is a cage. You hit him. You dragged me from the station. You called me. You called me those names. I will die in this cell before I am your wife."
The finality of it struck him. This was not a plea. It was a declaration of war. Randall's face, the handsome, civilized mask, dissolved. Beneath it was a pure, ugly rage. He had been denied. He had been shamed, first by the drifter, and now by the woman herself, in front of his men, in front of the law.
"You ungrateful wretch,"
he hissed. He lunged into the cell, his good hand grabbing her arm, the one that was not in the sling. He yanked her, hard, pulling her off balance.
"You are my property. The law says so. You will come with me if I have to drag you through every street in this town."
He began to pull her, his fingers digging into her arm, dragging her across the stone floor.
Clara's terror, her shame, her grief, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of pure, primal violation. He was touching her. He was dragging her. He was proving her right. She opened her mouth, and she screamed. It was not a cry for help. It was not a sound of pain. It was a raw, piercing shriek of pure fury, a sound of such profound violation that it seemed to shake the stones of the jail. It was a sound that could not be ignored. It ripped through the jailhouse, out the open door, and into the cold morning air of Garnet. In the cell opposite, Elias roared. It was a wordless, animal sound of pure, unadulterated fury. He launched himself at his cell door. The lock held. He grabbed the bars, his wounded shoulder screaming, and pulled. The iron was unmoving. Outside, the town, which had been stirring, now stopped. The whispering women on the boardwalk, the men in the saloon, the mercantile owner, they all heard it. It was not a sound of common trouble. It was the sound of something terrible. Sheriff Brody, who had been arguing with Randall's men by his desk, spun around. "Creighton! Let her go! That is enough!" But Randall was lost in his rage. He had Clara by the door of the cell now, pulling her into the corridor. Shut up, you harlot!" Clara screamed again, thrashing, trying to plant her feet. The townspeople began to move. They came from the store, from the saloon. They began to cluster at the open door of the jail, peering in, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. Mrs. Gideon, the preacher's wife, was at the front, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin, shocked line. They saw it. They saw the richest man in the county, Randall Creighton, dragging his intended bride, a woman in rags, from a jail cell. In his cell, Elias saw Clara fall to her knees, saw Randall raise his good hand to strike her. That was the end. Elias turned from the door, his eyes wild, feverish. He was not cuffed to the wall. He was loose in the cell, but the door was locked. He saw the cut. It was iron, bolted to the floor. He grabbed the edge, his good hand and his wounded one, and pulled. The bolts groaned. He roared again, a sound of inhuman effort, and ripped the cot from the floor, the screws tearing free from the wood planks. It was heavy, it was awkward. He did not care. He turned, took 2 steps, and swung the iron cot like a battering ram against the cell door. The sound was a deafening explosion of metal on metal. The hinges strained. The lock bar bent. "What in God's name?" one of the deputies shouted, drawing his gun. Elias hit it again. The hinges tore from the rotted wood frame. The door, lock and all, burst outward, crashing into the corridor, sending the deputy sprawling. Chaos erupted. Clara was on the floor. Randall, shocked, had let her go. Sheriff Brody was shouting, "Boone, no, stay put!" Elias was a creature from a nightmare. He was bare-chested, his bandage a ruin of red. His eyes were burning with fever and rage. He did not have his gun. He did not need one. He was beyond reason. Silas, Randall's man, raised his revolver to fire. Elias was on him before he could pull the trigger. He slammed his good fist into the man's jaw, a blow that snapped his head back. Silas went down, unconscious. The other man, Jed, grabbed Elias from behind, trying to pin his arms. Elias threw him off, his wounded shoulder taking the strain, a scream of pure agony tearing from his own lips. He stumbled, but he did not fall. He kept moving, toward Randall. Randall scrambled back, his face a mask of pure terror. He had seen fury, but he had never seen this. This was not a man. This was a force. "Sheriff!" Randall shrieked. "Shoot him! He's insane! Shoot him!" Sheriff Brody was trying to get between them, his revolver in his hand, but not aimed. "Boone, stop! This is the law. You are making it worse." The crowd at the door was screaming now, people pushing, falling back in terror. Randall, trapped between Elias and the sheriff's desk, saw his life ending.
He saw the drifter, this thing he had tried to crush, coming to kill him. His hand, the good one, dove inside his tailored coat. He pulled his own revolver, the same one he had used to club Elias. He raised it, leveling it at Elias's chest. "Elias!" Clara screamed. She was on her feet. She was next to the sheriff's desk, and on the wall behind it, in a simple wooden rack, was the sheriff's rifle, a heavy Winchester. She did not think, she did not plan, she did not weigh the sin, she just acted. She grabbed the rifle. It was heavy, long. She did not know how to aim it. She did not know how to hold it. She just ripped it from the rack, turned, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small stone room. It was the loudest sound in the world. Flame and smoke erupted from the barrel. The recoil slammed the rifle butt back into her shoulder, throwing her back against the wall. Randall Creighton stood for one long, impossible second. His hand, holding the revolver, was still raised. A look of profound, stupid surprise crossed his face. He looked down. A small, dark hole had appeared in the center of his white shirt. It blossomed, turning red. His gun clattered to the floor. His knees buckled. He fell forward, his body hitting the stone with a wet, final sound. Silence. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper than the snow. It was heavier than the stone walls. The crowd at the door was frozen. The deputies were frozen. Elias was frozen, his fist still raised. Clara slid down the wall, the heavy rifle falling from her numb fingers. Snow, light and delicate, drifted in through the open jailhouse door, the flakes beginning to settle on Randall's dark, still hair. Elias was the first to move. He turned, his rage gone, replaced by a vast, hollow shock. He went to her. He knelt, his knees cracking on the stone. He did not touch the rifle. He touched her. He put his good arm around her, pulling her away from the wall, away from the sight of what she had done. She collapsed against him, her body limp, her eyes wide, staring, but seeing nothing. She was in shock. Elias caught her. He held her, his hand stroking her matted hair, his own body trembling from the fever, the fight, the sudden, terrible release. Sheriff Brody stood over Randall's body. He looked at the man, then at the revolver lying by his hand. He looked at Clara, a small, broken thing in the drifter's arms. He looked at the crowd of witnesses, their faces pale, their mouths open. He let out a long, slow breath. He bent down and picked up Randall's revolver. He checked it. "He was going to shoot," Brody said, his voice loud enough for the whole room, for the crowd, to hear. "He had his weapon drawn. I saw it. You all saw it." He looked at Mrs. Gideon, the preacher's wife. Her face was white, her hands clasped at her throat. She nodded. A tiny, jerky movement. "She fired in defense," the sheriff declared. He pointed at Elias. "And in defense of this man, who he was also about to shoot. It was self-defense, clear as day. He had made his decision. Justice in the West was cold, but it was also practical. Randall Creighton was a problem, and that problem was now solved. "Jed," he said to the deputy, who was picking himself up. "Get him to the undertaker. You," he said to the other deputy, "get these people out of here. The show is over." The crowd dispersed, not quickly, but in stunned, quiet groups, already whispering. The story of the mail-order bride and the shooting growing with every step. The sheriff turned back to Elias, who was still holding Clara. "Son," he said, his voice quiet, weary. Elias looked up, his eyes clouded with fever. "She's clear," Brody said. "But you are not." Elias nodded. He had known. "You assaulted 2 of my deputies. You resisted arrest. You started a riot in a county jail. You destroyed county property." He pointed at the mangled cell door. "By the letter of the law, I should hang you, right here, Before noon. Clara stirred, her head lifting.
No, no, you cannot. He was protecting me.
I know what he was doing, Miss, the sheriff said, not unkindly. And I saw what Creighton did. That is the only reason you are not both in chains. But I cannot ignore this. The law is the law, and this town, it will not stand for it. They saw you, Boone. They saw a wild man. They are scared. Elias met his gaze.
So what happens?
So you leave. Brody said, I am giving you until nightfall. You get on your horse, and you ride out of this county. If you are here when the sun sets, I will arrest you. And if you are here when the sun rises, I will hang you. Am I clear? My horse, Elias began. I found him, the sheriff said, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. Your gelding. Found him in a drift this morning. Half dead. He's at the livery. He's alive. That's all I can say for him. My deputy will take you there. Elias nodded. It was more than he could have hoped for. Clara, he said, his voice rough. He tried to stand, but his legs were weak.
No,
she whispered, her grip on his shirt tightening.
No, you cannot. Elias, do not leave me. Take me with you, please. I cannot stay here.
She looked around the jail, at the blood stain on the floor, at the cold, judging eyes of the deputy. She looked past him, at the town that had already condemned her.
I have nowhere to go,
she pleaded, the tears finally coming, hot and fast.
They hate me. I have nothing. Please take me with you.
Elias looked at her. He saw her desperation. He saw her terror. And he saw her strength. The strength that had pulled that trigger. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. He wanted to pull her onto that horse and ride until this whole cold, ugly world was just a bad memory. But he looked down at his wounded shoulder. He felt the fever burning in his blood. He had no money. He had no prospects. He was a wanted man, a drifter, riding into a blizzard on a lame horse. To take her with him was not to save her. It was to condemn her to his own life. It was to ask her to freeze to death, slowly, over years. He put his good hand on her cheek, his rough thumb wiping away a tear. Clara, he said, his voice agonizingly gentle, you have fought enough. He looked at the sheriff. She has nowhere to go. You cannot just let her go. That preacher's wife. I will handle it, Brody said. She is a witness. She is cleared of any crime. She's free. She can stay at the hotel until she figures her way. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a few dollars. This will get her a room and a meal. Elias shook his head. He looked at Clara. You cannot go with me. I have nothing. I am nothing. Just a drifter, running from a rope. You would not last a day. I do not care, she wept, clinging to him. I care, he said, and his voice was firm. He pulled her hands away from his shirt. You are strong. You are stronger than you know. You survived the station. You survived Creighton. You survived this. He looked her in the eyes. You will survive this town. Stay, make a life. Do not become me. He stood up, his body screaming in protest. The deputy took his arm. I will walk with him, Clara said, scrambling to her feet. To the livery, please. The sheriff nodded. They walked out of the jail, into the cold, gray afternoon. The town was quiet, watching them from behind curtains. Clara, still in the brakeman's coat, her feet now wrapped in clean rags the sheriff had given her. Elias, his bloody bandage visible, his steps unsteady, his head bowed. They walked the short distance to the livery. The stable was warm, smelling of hay and animals. In a stall, Buck stood, his head low. He was thin, and his leg was still swollen, but he was alive. The deputy put a saddle on him. He will not go far, Boone, but he will go. Elias took the reins. He turned to Clara. They were alone, just for a moment, in the shadows of the stable. He did not know what to say. There were no words for this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old sheepskin coat he had been wearing when he first arrived, the one he had wrapped her in. In the storm, it was torn and stained with his blood, but it was thick. "Take this," he said. "It is warmer than the railroads." She shook her head, her tears starting again. "Take it," he commanded, his voice rough. He draped it over her shoulders. It enveloped her, smelling of him, of smoke and horse and the cold. He mounted the horse. Buck shifted, groaning at the weight, but held. They walked out of the stable. To the edge of town, they stopped, right by the desolate, snowbound train station where it had all begun. The sun was setting. The sky was a cold, dying streak of orange and purple. Night was coming. He had to go. He looked down at her. She was so small, standing there in the snow, in his coat. He leaned down from the saddle. He did not kiss her. He could not. It was too much, and not enough. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers. She reached up, her hand on his cheek. His beard was rough, his skin hot with fever. "Elias," she whispered. "Do not freeze again. Clara," he said. He pulled back. He looked at her one last time, memorizing her face, the strength in her eyes, the set of her jaw. Then he turned his horse, and he rode west, into the dying light, until he was just a small, dark shape against the snow. And then he was gone. Months later, the snow melted. The world, which had been white and gray, exploded into a fragile, fierce green. The frozen creek by the telegraph cabin thawed, its water rushing. On the plains, wild bluebells and Indian paintbrush pushed through the damp, dark dirt. Spring had come to Wyoming. The train station at Garnet was reopened. The broken boards were mended. The windows were washed. A new, black, pot-bellied stove sat in the center of the waiting room, its pipe clean. Clara Hensley worked there. She had stayed, she had taken the sheriff's money, and then she had found work. At first, it was mending clothes for the mercantile, but the station master, when he returned, was an old man, and his hands shook. He needed help. Clara could read, she could write, she could do sums. She sold tickets, she swept the floors, she helped travelers, women mostly, who arrived lost and afraid. Just as she had, she gave them coffee. She told them where the hotel was. She told them they were strong, that they would survive. The town had, slowly, accepted her. Mrs. Gideon had even nodded to her. Once, they no longer saw a harlot. They saw the woman who had killed Randall Creighton. They respected her with a quiet, fearful awe. She was saving her money. She planned to buy a small house. At the edge of town, she was free. One evening, in late May, she was standing on the platform, watching the sunset. The tracks, which had been buried, now shone like rivers of gold, stretching east and west. The air was warm, smelling of pine and damp earth. She heard it. Not a train, hoofbeats. A single rider, coming from the west. She stood very still, her heart a sudden, cold stone in her chest. He rode slowly, not like a man running. He stopped at the hitching post, the same one Elias had used. The horse was not Buck, it was a strong bay mare. The man dismounted. He was thinner than she remembered, and he walked with a slight limp. His coat was new, but his hat was the same. He took it off. His hair was longer. The scar on his temple, where Randall had hit him, was a faint, white line. He looked older. He looked tired, but he was alive. Elias Boone stood there, his hat in his hand, and he smiled. It was not a grin. It was a faint, hesitant, fragile smile. Clara did not run to him. She did not speak. She just stepped off the platform, onto the solid earth. She stood 10 feet from him, her hands clasped at her waist, and she began to shiver. Not from the cold. The air was warm. She shivered from something else. Something that had been frozen inside her all those months. Something that had never, ever died. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.